Hello, my name is Dana Tanner Kennedy. I'm a lecturer at the University of Alberta in Western Canada, and I'm here to talk to you today about my article in the recent Theatre Journal on magic. My essay is entitled Magic Acts.
Oh my gosh, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Jane Barnette. I am a professor at the University of Kansas, and I write about witches and representation of witches.
We're in a good place to talk about witches and magic. I think we should start by defining a few terms because there's a lot of sticky terms that, anytime you're talking about theater and performance and representation, of course, there's sticky terms. So we're going to deal with the ones that we've come across in our writing and in our little corner of the field. I'm going to start with metaphysical religion because that's something that I deal with in my article. I think it kind of serves as an umbrella term and has some large concepts that we're going to come back to over the course of this conversation. So, metaphysical religion is a term that comes from religious studies, and it is introduced by Catherine Albanese, who's a religious studies scholar, and she uses it as a large umbrella term to talk about a lot of different paths that she unites under this term, including witchcraft, paganism, polytheistic traditions, but she also includes things like New Age beliefs. She includes Freemasonry, Shakers. The Shakers are in there, interestingly, but she makes a giant case for how this particular strand of religious thought and practice and identity forms a kind of braid in American religion with evangelicalism and denominationalism. She argues that it's been there since the colonial foundings of the country. And so one of the things that she talks about that I really found fascinating for the performances that I deal with in my essay, and I talk in particular about Daniel Alexander Jones's Blacklight and Sybil Kempson's 12 Shouts to the 10 Forgotten Heavens, these two performance pieces. And I talk about them as being in dialogue with metaphysical religion. So two of the things that I want to mention about metaphysical religion that I think will be really useful to us, one of the ideas that is central to it is the concept of correspondences. So correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm. And Albanese talks about the idea that when you harness these correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm and bring them into alignment, the result is a kind of healing. And that's the major thrust of these religious traditions, this sense of spiritual healing, as opposed to, say, the central focus of Christianity is salvation. Right. So we're talking about practices and traditions that are dealing with a kind of spiritual healing by bringing things into alignment with spirit. So those things feature in the performances that I talk about, and also in the works that Jane is writing about as well. So that's the first thing I wanted to address. Let's tackle magic, shall we? Which is the topic of this issue.
Yeah, well, I'm so grateful for the way that you have framed this with metaphysical religion and or the sort of umbrella term that you have brought into the conversation. When it comes to magic, what I found myself more interested in was the kind of magic that people who call themselves witches in everyday life might enact. But the part of me that is very strong here is what I would sort of call the witch spectator, right? The person who is sitting in the audience who herself or himself or their self are familiar with witchcraft among their peers or perhaps themselves have tried it. And then they see on stage a representation of something that's supposed to be quote unquote real witchcraft. And it looks nothing like it. And that's where I got really interested in the politics of representing witches on stage. And in that case, I think it's, at least for me, the easiest definition for me to pull is one that comes back to a question of intention, of taking an intention and making it manifest. The tricky part is I don't know any witch that would tell you that there's proof, right? Like you can't just sort of, it's a lot like prayer. I think it's complicated.
It's very complicated. It's very complicated. But I think, I mean, I I like that definition of magic, and I was going to offer an additional related one, which comes from Chris Gosden, who wrote a book, this wonderful trade paperback called Magic, and it's a history of magic through the course of human history. And he looks at all different cultures, but he says very basically that that it implies a personal relationship to the universe, and the idea that he says people are open to the working of the universe, and the universe is responsive to us. So
Ooh,
automatically
I
that
like
puts
that.
us, it's so good, right? It's good. So it puts us in what we call a porous cosmos, right? And so
Mm,
one of the ways that I think, you might identify someone as a witch by their practices, and certainly the works that I'm talking about in my article, they presuppose a kind of porous cosmos, right? And it makes sense if you think back about the idea of macrocosm and microcosm being in alignment. It sort of imagines this idea that this is Albanese again, but she talks about a free flow of spirit energy between those realms, right? And so if you can have that flow of energy between realms, then you can make the additional leap, which magic is rooted in, that you can influence things through resonances, that the world is a kind of web of resonances between all different things, these correspondences, and that if you pull this string here, it's going to affect this thing over here. So I love that idea. And so would you say, I mean, this is where it gets tricky again, it's like, does a witch always practice magic? Not necessarily. And right. And people who practice magic are not necessarily witches. The
mhm.
the people that I write about in my article, I want to be really clear, even though I invoke the image of the witch at places in my article, neither of them has explicitly referred to themselves as witches, even though
Mm.
I make the argument that their pieces perform magic.
Well, the one that I think is sort of haunting us right now, the elephant in the room, if you will, is the sleight of hand magic, right? Because we are
Oh,
in
great.
a
Thank you.
theater
Yes.
performance context. And
Yeah.
I remember an early version of this at Astor at a plenary that you were
Yeah.
speaking, and there were some other speakers. And it was a very interesting plenary because there were folks on that panel whose definition of magic was sleight of hand, was about trickery, was about the performance of a thing that was supposed to be like a magic trick,
Mhm.
but that was very much rehearsed, and everybody was supposed to understand that what we were to admire was the virtuosity of performance and not the reality of the transformation. Um,
Yes, which is a
and
fascinating form, right? And it has
yeah,
its own history. Go ahead, sorry.
right. Right. But I find that while it's intriguing to put that in conversation with the kind of magic we're talking about, I'm personally less interested in that. I mean, I find it fascinating. I've been to see magic shows. I think that stuff
Mhm.
is interesting, right?
Totally.
But it's not nearly as deeply resonant with some of these bigger questions of the universe that tend to hit you in the face when you're doing work on witches or magic, or as you call it, post-secular theater. I love this term, by the way, and I know we're going to get more into this. And that's when I think, I get really excited because, frankly, of the history of theater. And here I know we've talked about this before, but you know how excited I get when we start to really recognize, re-embrace, name and claim the ritual roots of theater, the
Yes.
fact that theater was part of a religious ceremony. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yes, amazing. And I think there's a lot of interesting thought that's resurfacing, reconsidering those ideas right now. I want to ask you a question about Agatha, which I know you're thinking about a lot lately because of a chapter in an upcoming book. Do you want to mention this book to us now?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited about this. The book is an edited collection. It's called Television Costume as Televisual Culture. And it
Mm.
is going to be edited by Kristen Essen and Julie Ripley. And it's basically all sorts of different television shows or series and different contributors talking about the way that their costume basically, yes, helps to create the context in the world that they're living in, but also has a kind of eventness, has a kind of why this television show nowness. It's dramaturgical, in other words. So
Mm,
that's, of course, why I was so interested.
of course, yeah. So this visual dimension is absolutely central to the argument you're making in your chapter. But you call the show, the entire series, you called it a visual spell, which was so evocative for me when I was thinking through potential meanings. And I wonder if you could say something about that. And do you think that the show works a kind of magic on the viewer?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. And that's why I was so pleased to see some similar kinds of conclusions coming through in your article in terms of the way that these pieces that you're looking at, what they do and how they function. But in terms of this notion of a visual spell, it is clear to me, especially now that I'm on the other side of this essay, that the showrunner, Jack Schaefer, had a lot of knowledge of witchcraft, of witch history. And I mean, literally, there was a moment where I was like, did she read my book?
Yeah.
I, I mean, I hope, I wish, but more to the
Yeah.
point, really thoroughly researched. There's also this continuity with WandaVision. So, for example, in the finale of WandaVision, there is this showdown between Agatha Harkness and Scarlet Witch. And at one point, there are runes that appear in the air, in the cosmos, so to speak. And this designer, Daniel Ceylon, has taken those runes and put them in the interior of the jacket that Agatha wears on the road. So when she opens her jacket, which literally we only see maybe a tiny, tiny glimpse of, but thankfully, because of social media, there are lots of close-ups and much better lighting that we can see the designs, but also the reality of what that looked like. And, just to kind of have that depth of continuity, but also knowledge about different kinds of metaphysical religious practices that use sigils, that use runes, different language types and symbols that then when they are put into a costume or into the background of the series for people who are in the know, again, it's kind of like being able to see something on two levels, right? Because I'm able to read that and say, oh, those are runes. And in fact, those are not just any runes. Those are the runes that we saw in WandaVision and beyond, because they've shown up in other parts of the cinematic universe. But for people who, like, if my grandmother were still alive as a Baptist, right, she wouldn't know what those things were. She'd just be like, oh, that's pretty. It's purple. So going back to that definition of magic, that that sort of lure a viewer who is willing to see the magic into, yes, a bit of a spell where we really, to quote another television series that is long gone, unfortunately, the X-Files, to quote Mulder, we want to believe, right? We really
Mm,
want to believe.
mm, mm. I love this idea of the wanting to believe because I feel like that's really key to some of the things that I've been exploring and how you brought up this term post-secular theater, which this is my larger book project and the chapter on magic and metaphysical religion, which is excerpted in this Theater Journal article, is part of this larger look at the idea of the post-secular. So one of the things I've been thinking about is how these works create space for audiences
Mm.
to try on the possibility of belief. So,
Mm.
and they do
Mm.
that in a variety of ways. In the works that I deal with in this chapter, one of the ways that they do it is through humor. There's a kind of invitation there through humor. But in that trying on of belief, you may or may not experience the magical efficacy of the pieces, that
Mm.
potentiality is lying in wait for audiences if they choose to kind of cross that threshold with them. And
Mm.
it's okay to sort of remain a spectator, but there are ways in which they invite you to participate. And then these two pieces that I deal with in the article, they quite literally invite you to participate. So there's this invitation to, very clearly in these pieces, to cross that threshold into practice. And what happens when you practice? If you're skeptically inclined, you get a little taste. You don't have to go full in. The pieces don't seek to teach or convert. No
Yeah.
post-secular piece does that. They're not. They're about a kind of oscillation between the possibility of belief and unbelief, and putting spectators in that space to have a little taste of that. We were talking about Schechner's terms. He talks about this braid of efficacy and entertainment, right? But I've been really drawn to his notion of theater as make believe and
Hmm.
ritual as make belief. That part of ritual is engendering belief in the doer,
Yep.
and that somehow these works, these post secular works, and here more specifically these works that are in dialogue with magical traditions, are somewhere in between. They're not
I
just
love
make
this.
believe. They're not entirely make believe. They're created for secular stages by professional artists, but there's something going on there that is beyond the boundaries of, they're reaching beyond the boundaries of the material realm.
100%. And I think theater is primed to do that. So that's one of those areas that Schechner helps us really zero in on. And I think it's very much in keeping with what I have written about in terms of with
Yes.
adaptation, that we are almost always trafficking with the uncanny, with the numinous. It seems like both Jones and Kimpson are working with a similar idea as what's happening in Agatha All Along, in terms of how they're seeing and playing with these moments of time as well. Because at
Mhm.
least in episode 7, when you're saying horizontal and verticality, I talk a lot about that in witch fulfillment, because it really just comes up over and over again whenever we're staging witches, thinking about defying gravity. Hello. But I'm
Yes.
thinking about this really memorable moment that both starts and almost ends the episode 7, that is of Lapone falling. And when we first see her, when we see somebody falling, of course, we're assuming that they're going from the ceiling to the floor because we have a presupposition of gravity.
Right.
But what is so interesting in episode 7, and I hope by this point I'm not spoiling anything for anyone, but there is a moment when that is upended, quite
Mhm.
literally. So we even have like an hourglass, which itself reminds us of a kind of verticality of time. But then when it
Mhm.
gets turned over, yes, the sand starts again. But in this case, the whole place gets turned upside down in terms of where is the floor and where is the ceiling and what does falling now mean.
Mm.
And that topsy-turviness, to me, is one of the most brilliant visual metaphors for what I understand to be queer time. Time slips, according to Jack Pryor, that I've ever been able to kind of digest, right? There's just something very, very powerful about imagining what we have as a linearity kind of concept of time moving forward, and quite literally turning it and
Yeah.
thinking more again about the longevity here of maiden mother crone, sure,
Mm.
but also of, as you were mentioning with Jones and this website, of well beyond Earth and
Cosmic
into
time.
exactly.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with your, you calling on these images of verticality. Also, I outlined 4 hallmarks of what I think of as post-secular theater. Like, how do you identify something that's post-secular? And this reintroduction of the vertical into the horizontal imaginary is really huge for me. And that's where Angels in America, which of course is a little bit outside of the scope of my work, but it becomes an important ancestor. The idea of this sort of the horizontal reality of New York City and of the secular world and secular time and all of these things are suddenly literally bisected, broken open, and shattered by the entrance of this angel, right? And that is, yeah, right? I mean, that is an incredible image. And so I love to hear you talk about how you see this with witches and obviously, of course, defying gravity. I mean, that's that's amazing. But we see it over and over again throughout different religious traditions too, which I talk about, throughout the book. Yeah.
One Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I'm
Yes.
really excited for this particular issue,
Me
and
too.
it's been a long time coming, and I'm so grateful that the field is starting to really address some of these topics again.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to Theater Journal for inviting us to have this chat with each other. And I look forward to the issue as well, and all of the different ways that our colleagues are going to be thinking about magic. So thank you so much.